Three Gorges Dam. Progress at the cost of millions of lives. The world's largest dam stands as a monument to human ambition and engineering prowess. But beneath its concrete walls lies a story few dare to tell. Over 1 million people displaced from their ancestral homes. Ancient cities drowned forever. Corruption that stole millions from the desperate. Construction deaths that were swept under the rug. Environmental disasters that threatened 400 million lives downstream. This is not just a story of a dam. This is a story of progress built on the backs of the forgotten, where the price of power was measured in human suffering. What really happened during the construction of the Three Gorges Dam? The truth is more shocking than you could ever imagine. A dream born in blood. The year was 1918. Sun Yat-sen, China's first provisional president, stood before the mighty Yangtze River and envisioned something extraordinary. A massive dam that would tame the river's devastating floods and power the nation's future. It was a visionary idea, but one that would take decades and countless lives to realize. For years, the dream remained just that, a dream. Political upheaval, economic chaos, and social revolution kept the project dormant. In 1954, catastrophic flooding ravaged the countryside, killing thousands and leaving millions homeless. The communist government revived the plans. But even then, the debate raged. Was the cost worth it? Would the benefits outweigh the destruction? Enter Li Peng, a Soviet-trained engineer who rose through the ranks of China's power industry. Born in Shanghai in 1928, Li was the son of an early communist revolutionary executed by the Kuomintang. Raised by Premier Zhou Enlai himself, Li spent his formative years in Moscow, studying hydroelectric engineering at the prestigious Moscow Power Engineering Institute. He returned to China in 1955 with grand ambitions and the technical knowledge to fulfill them. By 1987, Li Peng had become premier of China, and the Three Gorges Dam became his obsession, his life's work, his legacy. Critics warned of environmental catastrophe. Scientists pleaded for caution. Environmentalists sounded alarms about the human cost. But Li Peng was determined. He had the power, the position, and the political will to make it happen. In April 1992, the moment of truth arrived. The National People's Congress, usually a rubber-stamp body that approved every government proposal without question, was asked to vote on the Three Gorges Dam project. What happened next shocked the nation. Out of over 2,600 delegates, only 1,767 voted in favor. 177 voted against. 664 abstained. 25 didn't vote at all. It was unprecedented. Almost one-third of the Congress refused to support the project. But Li Peng had his approval. The dam would be built. On December 14, 1994, Premier Li Peng stood at Sandiping, Yichang, in Hubei province, surrounded by government officials and international observers. The groundbreaking ceremony had arrived. The first explosives detonated, sending rocks and earth cascading into the air. The Yangtze River, unchanged for millennia, was about to be transformed forever. But what Li Peng and his supporters didn't mention during their celebratory speeches was a price that would be paid. The human price. Families living in the Three Gorges region received notices. 7 days. That's how much time they had. 7 days to pack up their lives, abandon homes their ancestors had occupied for generations, and relocate to unknown destinations. 7 days to say goodbye to everything they knew. The elderly wept. Children cried. Young adults protested. But the bulldozers were coming. The water would rise, and nothing would stop it. In the villages of Fengjie, Wanzhou, and Yunyang, panic set in. Where would they go? How would they survive? Government officials promised compensation, new homes, new opportunities. But the promises were vague, the details unclear. And for over 1 million people, the nightmare was just beginning. The human cost of progress. The displacement began in waves. First came the pilot programs in 1993. Entire villages were evacuated. Families were loaded onto buses with whatever possessions they could carry. The government had promised them new lives, better lives. But reality told a different story. 1.4 million people. That's how many individuals were forcibly relocated to make way for Three Gorges Dam Reservoir. 1,300 villages and towns wiped off the map, communities that had existed for centuries, erased in a matter of years. The scope of the displacement was staggering. Families who had farmed the same land for 20 generations were suddenly landless. Fishermen who had worked the Yangtze for their entire lives found themselves hundreds of miles from the river. The government set aside billions of yuan for resettlement compensation, funds meant to help displaced families rebuild their lives, buy new homes, start new businesses, survive the transition. But then the corruption began, and it was massive. In 1998 alone, investigators uncovered a scandal that shocked even the most cynical observers. $57 million in resettlement funds had vanished, simply disappeared. Corrupt local officials had embezzled the money meant for desperate families. They bought luxury apartments in Beijing and Shanghai. They opened businesses with stolen funds. They lived lavishly while the displaced suffered in poverty. By the time the full scope of the corruption was revealed, over $81 million had been stolen from resettlement programs. Families who were promised 20,000 yuan received 5,000. Some received nothing at all. They were relocated to barren hillsides with no arable land, no water source, no way to farm or survive. Government officials told them to be grateful, to be patriotic, to sacrifice for the greater good of China. But what was the greater good when your children were hungry, when your elderly parents couldn't access medical care, when you had no way to earn a living? The human stories were heartbreaking. In Wanzhou, an elderly woman named Mrs. Chen refused to leave her home. She had lived there for 78 years. Her husband was buried in the family plot behind the house. Her children had been born in that house. Her grandchildren had played in its courtyard. When officials came to force her out, she sat in front of her door and wept. They carried her away. Her house was demolished 3 days later. In Fengjie, a farmer named Mr. Zhang received compensation of 8,000 yuan for his home and land. The government relocated him to a hillside 300 kilometers away. The land was rocky and infertile. He tried to farm it, but nothing would grow. Within 2 years, he had spent all his compensation on food and necessities. He had no income, no prospects, and no way back. He hanged himself in his makeshift home. His wife found him. She was 43 years old and suddenly alone in a strange place with no support system. Stories like these multiplied across the region. Suicides, depression, poverty, families torn apart. And through it all, construction continued. The construction itself was deadly. Workers labored in dangerous conditions with inadequate safety equipment. In the year 2000, a massive crane collapsed at the construction site. 3 workers were crushed to death instantly. Several others were seriously injured. The accident was reported briefly in local media and then buried. The families received minimal compensation. The construction continued without pause. How many other deaths occurred during construction? The exact number remains unknown. The Chinese government never released comprehensive statistics. Independent investigators estimated dozens of construction deaths, possibly more. But the official records were sanitized. The deaths swept under the rug. The focus remained on progress, not on the human cost. What do you think about what you've seen so far? Was this displacement justified? Should governments have the power to force millions of people from their homes for a development project? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Drowning history, destroying lives. The water began to rise in June 2003. Slowly at first, half a centimeter per hour, then faster. The Yangtze River, diverted during construction through a massive canal system, was finally allowed to fill the reservoir, and as the water rose, history drowned. Over 1,200 archaeological sites vanished beneath the rising waters. 1,200. Ancient temples dating back to the Han Dynasty. Stone carvings from the Tang Dynasty. Historical records etched into cliff faces. Cultural artifacts that had survived 2,000 years of wars, dynasties, and revolutions, now lost forever in a matter of months. Archaeologists scrambled to save what they could. Teams worked around the clock, excavating sites, photographing artifacts, trying desperately to preserve some fragment of China's history before the water claimed it all. But there was too much, too many sites, Too little time. 90% of the archaeological treasures in the Three Gorges region were never excavated. They simply disappeared beneath the water, lost to humanity forever. The legendary beauty of the Three Gorges, celebrated in Chinese poetry and art for centuries, was transformed. The towering limestone cliffs that had inspired generations of artists were partially submerged. The narrow gorges that had challenged sailors for millennia were widened and deepened. The landscape that had defined the region's identity was permanently altered. What remained was a shadow of what once was. But the destruction of history was only part of the story. The construction process itself became mired in corruption at every level. Contractors won bids through bribery rather than merit. Once awarded contracts, they cut corners to maximize profits. Equipment that should have been new was actually used and refurbished. Materials that should have met strict quality standards were substandard. Safety protocols were ignored. Former Premier Zhu Rongji, who succeeded Li Peng in 1998, publicly accused construction companies of shoddy engineering. He coined the term tofu dregs projects to describe buildings and infrastructure that looked solid but crumbled at the slightest pressure. Inspectors found exactly that at Three Gorges. Concrete that didn't meet specifications. Steel reinforcements that were inadequate. Foundations that were questionable. The head of the Three Gorges Economic Development Corporation was eventually arrested for corruption, but by then the damage was done. Billions of yuan had been siphoned off the project, and the question remained, how safe was a dam built with corrupt practices at every level? Meanwhile, voices of opposition were brutally silenced. Dai Qing, a courageous journalist and former intelligence agent, had been speaking out against the Three Gorges Dam since the mid-1980s. In 1989, she compiled and published a book called Yangtze. It was a collection of essays and interviews with prominent Chinese scientists, environmentalists, and intellectuals who opposed the dam project. The book detailed the environmental risks, the social costs, the engineering concerns, and the corruption that was already beginning to plague the planning stages. The book was extraordinary. For the first time in post-1949 Chinese politics, intellectuals and public figures were openly lobbying to influence government decision-making. The book created enough pressure that the State Council postponed the Three Gorges project for 5 years. It was a watershed moment, a brief victory for transparency and public discourse. But then came June 4th, 1989, the Tiananmen Square massacre. The Chinese government crushed the pro-democracy movement with military force. And in the aftermath, Dai Qing was targeted. In July 1989, she was secretly arrested. No trial, no charges, just detention. She spent 10 months in Qinqing prison, Beijing's maximum security facility, held in isolation. Her book was banned. The remaining 30,000 copies were recalled and destroyed. She was expelled from her position at the Guangming Daily newspaper and barred from publishing anything in China. The message was clear. Opposition to the Three Gorges Dam would not be tolerated. Speak out and you would be silenced. For the next several years, no one dared to criticize the project publicly. And Li Peng, the chief political beneficiary of the Tiananmen crackdown, was free to push his beloved dam project forward without resistance. I want to take a moment to thank you for staying with us through this journey. What you're learning about the Three Gorges Dam is information many people never hear. The truth behind the propaganda. The reality behind the progress. And believe me, the most shocking revelations are still ahead. The environmental devastation. The ongoing threats. The consequences that continue to this day. Stay with us. The story gets even more unbelievable from here. The price no one wanted to pay. The reservoir filled. The turbines began to spin. By 2009, the Three Gorges Dam was fully operational, generating 18,000 megawatts of electricity. It was hailed as a triumph of Chinese engineering, a symbol of national pride. But the environmental consequences that scientists had warned about for decades were already beginning to manifest, and they were catastrophic. Landslides. That was the first major problem. The sheer weight of the reservoir, holding back billions of cubic meters of water, created immense geological pressure on the surrounding landscape. The hillsides along the reservoir began to destabilize. In 2003, a massive landslide in Jiangping killed 24 people. An entire hillside collapsed into the reservoir, creating a tsunami-like wave that swept through nearby villages. Homes were destroyed. Families were buried alive. But that was just the beginning. By 2008, the Chinese government had recorded over 5,000 landslides in the reservoir region. 5,000. Some were small, others were massive, each one a deadly reminder that the geological stability scientists had warned about was never properly addressed. The wildlife suffered terribly. The Baiji River dolphin, also known as the Yangtze River dolphin, had survived in the river for 20 million years. It was one of only 4 freshwater dolphin species in the world, a living fossil, a symbol of the Yangtze's ancient ecosystem. By 2006, it was declared functionally extinct. The Three Gorges Dam had destroyed its habitat, disrupted its migration patterns, and fragmented its population to the point of no return. Gone. Forever. The Chinese sturgeon, a fish that had existed for 140 million years, faced a similar fate. Its spawning grounds were destroyed by the dam. Its population declined by 98%. Scientists warned it could be extinct within a generation. Water pollution skyrocketed. Before the dam, the Yangtze's flow helped disperse industrial and human waste downstream. But with the reservoir essentially creating a giant lake, the waste accumulated. Algae blooms became common. Water quality deteriorated dramatically. Cities downstream began experiencing water contamination. The river that had sustained Chinese civilization for 5,000 years was becoming toxic. But the most terrifying consequence was one that scientists had warned about from the very beginning. The dam sits on a major seismic fault line. The sheer weight of the reservoir, combined with the geological pressure it creates, increases the risk of earthquakes. In 2008, a catastrophic earthquake struck Sichuan province, just 200 kilometers from the Three Gorges Dam. Magnitude 7.9. 87,000 people died. Millions were left homeless. The devastation was unimaginable. Some scientists believe the reservoir's pressure triggered the earthquake. Others say it increased the earthquake severity. The Chinese government denied any connection, but seismologists around the world raised concerns. They pointed to similar cases where large reservoirs had been linked to increased seismic activity. They warned that the Three Gorges Dam represented an unprecedented geological risk. And then there's the ultimate nightmare scenario. What if the dam fails? What if an earthquake, a landslide, or structural weakness causes the dam to collapse? 400 million people live downstream from the Three Gorges Dam. 400 million. That's more than the entire population of the United States. If the dam were to fail catastrophically, the resulting flood would be the worst disaster in human history. Entire cities would be swept away. Shanghai, one of the world's largest cities, would be inundated. The death toll could be in the tens of millions. Engineers insist the dam is safe. They point to its massive concrete structure, its sophisticated monitoring systems, its backup safety features. But the corruption during construction raises questions. The geological instability raises questions. The unprecedented scale of the project raises questions. And the fact that the dam was built against the advice of many of China's top scientists and engineers raises the most troubling question of all. Was this risk ever justified? The truth they tried to hide. For years, the Chinese government presented the Three Gorges Dam as an unqualified success. State media ran glowing reports about clean energy, flood control, and economic development. International delegations were given carefully staged tours. Dissenting voices were silenced. But by 2007, even the government could no longer hide the truth. In an extraordinary admission, the State Council acknowledged that the Three Gorges Dam had caused an array of ecological ills and warned that without immediate action, the problem could lead to environmental catastrophe. Environmental catastrophe. Those were the government's own words. The same government that had insisted for decades that the dam was safe, beneficial, and necessary. The admission came too late for the 1.4 million people who had already been displaced. Too late for the ancient cities and archaeological sites that had already been drowned. Too late for the extinct species. Too late for the families who had lost everything. And the corruption continued even after the dam's completion. Officials at the China Three Gorges Corporation, the state-owned enterprise managing the dam, were found guilty of nepotism, fraud, and embezzlement. Family members of high-ranking officials were given lucrative contracts. Bribes were paid for promotions and positions. The black hole of corruption, as journalist Dai Qing called it, never stopped consuming money and resources. Meanwhile, ordinary Chinese citizens had been paying for the dam without even realizing it. Between 1992 and 2009, a surcharge called built-into power price was added to every electricity bill in China. Every household, every business, every factory was forced to contribute to the Three Gorges Dam construction. The government collected hundreds of billions of yuan through this hidden tax. Citizens had no choice, no vote, no say in the matter. They simply paid, whether they supported the project or not. Today, the Three Gorges Dam stands as the world's largest hydroelectric power station. It generates enough electricity to power major cities. It has reduced some flooding along the Yangtze River. It has improved shipping capacity. These are real benefits. But the question remains, was it worth the price? Was it worth displacing 1.4 million people, many of whom ended up worse off than before? Was it worth destroying over 1,200 archaeological sites and erasing irreplaceable history? Was it worth driving species to extinction and poisoning the river? Was it worth the billions lost to corruption while families starve? Was it worth the deaths during construction, the landslides after completion, the ongoing geological risks? Was it worth placing 400 million people downstream in perpetual danger? Li Peng, the man who made the Three Gorges Dam his life's work, died in July 2019 at the age of 90. He never expressed regret for the project. He never apologized for the displacement, the corruption, or the environmental damage. To the end, he believed he had built a monument to Chinese progress and power. But history may judge him differently. History may see him as the man who sacrificed millions for his own legacy, the man who ignored science, silenced critics, and pushed forward a project that should never have been built. The dam is here now, permanent, irreversible. The water will never recede. The displaced will never return home. The drowned cities will never resurface. The extinct species will never come back. And 400 million people will live with the risk for generations to come. This is the true story of the Three Gorges Dam, not the propaganda, not the celebration of engineering triumph, but the human cost, the environmental devastation, the corruption, the silenced voices, the broken promises, the devastating consequences that continue to unfold. The Three Gorges Dam stands today as the world's largest hydroelectric power station, generating enough electricity to power major cities. But the human cost, the environmental devastation, and the corruption that plague every stage of its construction reveal a darker truth about progress at any price. Over 1 million people lost their homes. Thousands lost their lives. Billions of dollars vanished into corrupt pockets. Ancient history was drowned forever. And the threat remains, with 400 million people living in the shadow of a dam that sits on a fault line, a potential catastrophe waiting to happen. What do you think? Was this monumental achievement worth the terrible price paid by millions of innocent people? Should governments have the power to sacrifice entire communities for the greater good? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this investigation eye-opening, please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss our next revealing documentary. Don't forget to watch the next recommended video where we uncover another shocking truth that the world needs to know